Hey guys, today I'm going to go over DC Agent. We're going to start off by going over what DC Agent is, then we're going to move on to how DC Agent works at a high level. After that, we're going to go to how to properly set up DC Agent in your environment, kind of based on different particular environment scenarios. And then we're going to go over just a few troubleshooting steps and tips that you can use just to make sure your DC agent is working properly and that it's properly configured. So, as always, your first step when wanting to find information on any product that WebSense has is easily done by going to websense.com and then clicking on the Support tab. Once you've clicked on that, you can literally perform any search just as you would a Google search. So in here I can simply type in DC Agent, hit search, and instantly I get a ton of results for DC Agent. I can see DC Agent troubleshooting steps, general explanations. Now I usually want to get a little bit narrower in my search results as well, so I can say this is going to be for my product, web security, and I own Web Security Gateway Anywhere. So I'll select that, and then I'll select the particular version that I'm on, which is currently version 7.8.4, so I'll select the 7.8 version. And once I do that, you can see a lot of the results get narrowed down to specifically my versions and what's applicable to me. Sometimes this may be the best approach to take. If you feel like you're not getting enough results, you can always just uncheck the version and kind of peer through some of the other articles published for other versions, because a lot of changes do carry over and a lot of the troubleshooting steps are very similar from version to version. But I would first try narrowing it down, getting specific, and then expanding out your search if you don't find what you're looking for. Okay, with that said, let's go over what DC Agent is. So essentially DC Agent is a transparent identification tool employed by WebSense that's used to identify your users in your environment as they pass through your proxy or web filter. So that way, user John Smith can get the proper policy applied to him based on his user credentials. With that said, please note that DC Agent is just one of several ways to identify users in your environment. We also have other methods, such as our logon agent. We also have what we suggest using, which is integrated Windows authentication. Unfortunately, this can only be used if you are a WebSense Web Security Gateway or Web Security Gateway Anywhere customer, meaning you have one of our proxies employed in your environment. Essentially, DC Agent would be the next, aside from IWA, DC Agent is the next most widely used identification method. And when I say best effort, when in regards to DC Agent, what I mean is DC Agent does its best to identify users in your environment, but inherently, by the way it discovers users' names and IP addresses, it's only going to be so accurate in identifying those users all the time. Once again, the most accurate and probably the most suggested method to identify users in your environment, if you are a Web Security Gateway or Gateway Anywhere customer, meaning you have our proxy appliances installed, would be to use what's called integrated Windows authentication. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about how DC Agent works. So I've created just a quick Visio diagram that we can take a look at that just explains very basically how DC Agent works and how it should be configured in an environment. Okay, so essentially what happens is when your users log into their environment or log into your domain, a logon record is generated in your domain controller. What DC Agent does is it pulls your domain controller, meaning it reaches out and says, hey, let me have your most recent logon records. And it pulls those logon records back to internally create a map of users to IP addresses. So once DC Agent has created its map, what happens is on the appliances, like the web security gateway appliance, or on your web filter or web security server, what happens is those servers then ask the DC Agent server to provide them with that user map. So then when users travel outside of your or go outside of your environment to request a web page, they're traversing your proxy or over through your web filter or web security environment. What happens is, because that appliance or that web filter or security server have that map on there, they're able to identify the users that are coming through. Like I said, it is best effort because DC Agent is only able to collect logon records that are generated when the user actually logs into your domain. So if a user locks the computer or does not actually log off, a new record won't be generated until that user actually either logs off of the domain, then relogs back in, or until that user actually logs into maybe another machine in the environment. That's the only way new logon records can be created. So with that said, what this Visio diagram is essentially showing is how DC Agent would be set up in an environment that has several domain controllers. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking about essentially how to properly set DC Agent up. I'm going to go ahead and start by just going over some basics. So this is actually my DC Agent server. DC Agent can be installed on any Windows 2008 R2 server, 2012, and I believe 2012 R2. You can always go on our website and look at the system requirements for DC Agent, but I'm pretty sure those are our specifications to be able to use DC Agent. With that said, anytime you log into a server to install any WebSense application, you always want to log in as the service account that you're going to run DC Agent as. So in this case, I want DC Agent to use a dedicated service account that I've created for just WebSense applications. So I logged into this server as that service account, SVC WebSense. That's what I call it. That account does have administrator privileges on the server, which is essentially what's necessary and needed to install an agent like this. So what you would do is you'd log on with that service account, and then you'd have the WebSense installer either put on the desktop or anywhere you want, and you'd right-click and run the WebSense installer as administrator. So if I go ahead and go into, I've already installed DC Agent, so I'm not going to have this just the installer sitting on the desktop like a new install would. But you always want to right-click and run as administrator. Very important. So you run the installer as administrator. And then what would happen is it would extract all the files and load. Mine loaded quickly because I've already done this process before. And then you'd be presented with this screen. Essentially, it would ask, what component do you want to install? Now, if you're installing just DC Agent, you would select Web Security and you would click the Install button next to it. When you click the Install button, it would ask you what type of installation you want to do. You would want to select Custom. Once you've selected Custom, it will take you to an installation screen that lists out some of the components that you can install. And that's where you'll select the DC Agent to install. And I'll go ahead and quickly see if I can show you or give you an idea of what that looks like right here. We'll just give this a second to load. Looks like the components are loading up now. Give that one more second here. Alright, so I've already got DC Agent installed on this machine, but just to give you an idea of what the screen you'll see looks like when you select Custom, it's going to look similar to this. You're going to get a Select Components dialog, and then it's going to ask you what component you want to install. And in this, under the user identification, right here, you'll see the selection of DC Agent available. Like I said, I already have it installed, so it's not available right now to reinstall. But that's what you would see. And then you just follow through with the installer. So I'm going to go ahead and quit out of this. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close. Because I'm not actually going to install it, I was just letting you know how to go about the installation. Okay, so then once DC Agent is installed, you want to check for a couple things. First thing is you want to go into your services, and you want to make sure the computer browser service is started. Sometimes that's actually an issue when people go to install DC Agent, because this service usually isn't started by default. So you want to go ahead and start that before you even initiate the install of DC Agent. Once that's completed, you can go ahead and navigate to the folder in which DC Agent installed, or the web security component installed. In my instance, it's under the default location. So C, Program Files, WebSense, Web Security, and the bin folder. Once you're in the bin folder, what you're going to do is you're going to probably give DC Agent about 5 to 10 minutes after you've installed it, and then you want to look for a text file called dc_config. Let's go ahead and look for that. Okay, here's my text documents, and I can spot it right here. So if you look at that, you can see that that exists. What basically this file does is it's created by DC Agent, and essentially DC Agent will go out and discover all the domain controllers in your environment, or any servers that are running domain controller properties, or running the standard SMB ports. So it'll go out, it'll discover those, and then it'll populate this list with every domain controller it's found within your environment. You can see in mine, I actually only have one domain controller running, but you may have several. And I'm going to go ahead and get more into that, and what to do if you have a lot of domain controllers in your environment. So, once you've gotten DC Agent installed, you've verified that this dc_config.txt file is created, then you can move on to configuring DC Agent on the actual either web security filtering servers or web security servers or the appliances. You'll want to configure it on those as well, so they are picking up that user map that DC Agent is actually creating. So what you'll do next is then go to your Triton web security installation. So your essentially your WebSense manager, and this is the screen that you'll likely get right when you log in. It's the dashboard screen. You'll go to Settings, and then you want to navigate to User Identification. Okay. In User Identification, you'll want to select Add Agent. Okay, and it'll let you know which agent you want to add, and you'll select DC Agent. It'll ask you the IP address of the DC agent you're adding. Once you've done that, you'll select it and you'll hit OK and save and deploy. And once you've done that, you'll go ahead and see that DC Agent server listed here, and you can see mine is running right here at this IP address. So if we click on this, and this is something you'll want to do, is once you've added the DC Agent, you'll want to click right here on the actual DC agent, it's either going to show a host name or an IP address like mine. And you're going to want to configure a few things. And I'll go ahead and explain what a couple of these things mean. Domain discovery. So what this does is it tells DC agent how often to go out and look for new domain controllers in your environment. Because that's not something that probably happens, every minute of the day, you can choose how often you'd like it to go out and auto-discover domain controllers. I found that if you are a large environment that doesn't add them very often, 1 week is probably the best interval. If you're dynamic and you're growing and maybe going through a phase where you're adding domain controllers here or removing them in some spots, 24 hours is a good polling period to select. Kind of up to you. And then you can either use DC agent to do that discovery or the user service that is already running in your existing environment. It really doesn't matter which one. I've selected user agent in my example right here. Domain controller polling. So like before, I was explaining that DC agent essentially goes out and looks at your domain controllers and pulls back those user logon records. Well, what this domain controller polling setting does is specifies how often it looks at those logon records. As new users log in, which happen a lot throughout the day, you want DC agent to be as up to date as possible. What you have to do is try to strike a nice balance between how often DC agent is going out and hitting up those domain controllers for those logon records, as to not kind of overwhelm your domain controllers with requests. Generally, it's a very lightweight request, so you won't really run into many issues. And on average, query interval, I think of either 10 to 20 seconds is a good interval to use when querying the domain controllers. User entry timeout. So when these entries are put into the DC agent user map, which I'll show you here in a second, they have a timeout period specified for each one. And that means from the time that entry is entered in to that user map, it has this amount of time to exist in there before it's deleted out of it. If you have users that you believe are constantly moving, or you're just having general issues with users maybe not being identified in the environment because you have maybe wireless and they're moving with their laptops from floor to floor and their IP address changes very often, or maybe your DHCP environment is very active, so you have a lot of users taking the IP of a previous user quite often, so your DC agent lease interval isn't very long. Then you would want to move this user entry timeout to less than 24 hours. I'd recommend starting off with moving it to 12 hours and then down further if you'd like. Like I said, this is a lab environment. These are specific to my environment. You just have to kind of work with and see what works best within your environment. Computer polling. In about 99% of scenarios, you will want to turn computer polling off. So I'm just going to stop there and let you know, turn computer polling off when you come into these DC agent settings. Once you've set that up, you can go ahead and hit OK and then save and deploy, and it'll go ahead and save and deploy these settings for your DC agent. Now, something to note. If you have multiple appliances or web filtering servers within your environment, and they each will likely have a policy server installed on them, you might have a list of policy servers here, and you'll have a little switch command. Know that these DC agent settings are specific to each policy server instance. So when you log into your Triton Manager initially and you add a DC agent there, what you're basically doing is you're adding DC agent to one of these servers. So you're telling this server right here, now I want you to pull back information from this DC agent right here. What you have to do is use that switch command and go to each one of your different policy servers and then add the DC agent there as well. And also configure it on those separately as well. DC agent is a per policy server specific configuration. So once again, if you have multiple policy servers in your environment, you'll want to add DC agent to each policy server and configure it appropriately. Okay, with that said, let's say you've got DC agent installed and running now in your environment. Well, how can I verify that it's actually picking up users? The first thing to do is we have a cool little tool. It's a client. It's called Console Client. So you want to do start command prompt and run as admin. I just do that to be safe every time. And then we'll go ahead and I want to navigate to the C directory. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and navigate to that bin folder that DC_config file was in. So I'll go ahead and you can see I want to navigate to program files, web, sense, web security, and the bin folder. Go ahead and hit enter. And then I can use the command console client.exe localhost. So I'm on my DC agent server right now. 30601 is the port you're going to communicate to that utility on. What this is allowing us to do is generate a user map to see the users that are being identified by DC agent. So we'll go ahead and hit enter. Ooh, I must have mistyped something. Let's check it out. Yes I did. I missed an E. Console client. There we go. Let's try now. Alright, awesome. So you're just going to go through some canned steps here. You're going to hit 2, enter, 1, dump to local file, and the level is going to be 3. I'm going to hit enter. And then the file name. I want to go ahead and put this file on my desktop. So I'm going to go ahead and specify that path. And I'm going to call this file XID user map. All the X stands for is transparent identification user map. So I'll go ahead and hit enter. Right, and then I'm going to choose option 5. So now it's saying, what do you want to print to this text file that you're creating? So I'm going to hit 5 and hit enter. So I just did that, and you can see that this XID user map popped up on the screen right here. Now I'm going to go ahead and open it and show you what's in it. Alright, so it's just this text file. And like I said, basically it shows you the time that it was created, the number of entries that are in it, so the number of users, and the number of user entries that are in this file. And if we look at it, we see what it gives is the IP address of the where the user logged in from, the actual username that was logged in from that IP address, and then the timeout period I was talking about. So this is when this particular entry will expire. We can look at the entry time when it was created, and then the agent type stands for what was the identification agent that created this entry. It was the DC agent. That's what the DC stands for. So if I look in this, I can see I have a few users that have logged into my environment, and this is how DC agent is able to identify them based on querying my domain controller for those logon records. And it does a little bit more processing in the background to kind of correlate the IP and the actual username. But after that's all said and done, this is the result. Okay. So this is the map that's created on each individual DC agent. Now, what if we get into a scenario where you maybe have 16 or 17 domain controllers. One thing to note is that DC Agent can handle about 8 to 10 domain controllers a piece. So when you create or when you install DC Agent, what it's going to go ahead and do is it's going to create this DC_config file that we looked at earlier. Alright, if we look at that, it's going to have, and you have, let's say, like I said, about 16 domain controllers in your environment. If we look at this file, what you're going to see is that all of these domain controllers are going to be on. They're going to have the switch on configured in all of them, just like these do right here. So domain controller number 5, 2. So right now I have 2 through 17, which is a total of 16 domain controllers. When you initially install DC Agent, these will all be on. What you want to do is after this file is populated and configured by DC Agent, like I said, about 5 to 10 minutes after you've installed DC Agent, you're going to want to go into the file and you're going to want to turn off some of those domain controllers. And basically what you're doing here is telling DC Agent to not pull these domain controllers. Like I said, DC Agent can handle about 8 to 10 domain controllers, and that's best practice. So if you have 16 domain controllers in your environment, you should have 2 DC Agents installed, and they should each be monitoring 8 different domain controllers. So in this case, if I had 2 DC Agents installed and I had 16 domain controllers, I would go into the first DC Agent, I would look at its DC_config.txt file, and I would turn on the first 8 and I would turn off the last 8. Then I would go into the second DC Agent and I would do the opposite. I would turn off the first 8 and I'd turn on the last 8. This can be extrapolated for as many domain controllers in an environment. So if you have 64 domain controllers, you're going to have 8 DC Agents installed. It all depends on the amount of domain controllers out there. That's going to provide the best possible user identification that you can get from DC Agent. And I have a little, in my Visio diagram that I actually created, it kind of demonstrates this and how that would be set up. So let's say this is an environment that has, I'll make this full screen, that has 16 domain controllers. You can see all of my users will log on and authenticate to either one of these. We're not sure which one. But I know I need to collect information from both of them because half of my users could be authenticating to these domain controllers, and half could be authenticating to these 8 domain controllers. So what I need to do is have basically as the end result, a combined user map that has still all of my users collected in there. The reason is any of these users down here could go out of either one of these web filtering servers or my proxy servers, right? So if a user goes out of this proxy server and he authenticated to one of the domain controllers in 1 through 8, he needs to be able to be identified on this proxy server. Same scenario, if one of my users goes out of this top proxy server, he needs to have a combination of the user entries from both DC Agents in order to identify all those users or that particular user going through. So you can see that essentially you have several DC Agents collecting information from 8 domain controllers each, but then they're each entered into the configuration that I showed a second ago on the user identification page. So in this scenario, if I had an environment that's depicted like in this Visio diagram, I would have 2 DC Agents listed here. Each of these agents would be monitoring 8 domain controllers, kind of how I explained earlier in that DC_config.txt file. And this is, like I said, policy server specific. So you would, after you configured one policy server, so after you configure those user identification settings for this policy server, you would switch to this policy server and you configure both of these DC agents in there as well. What that allows is a combined user map, and each of these basically stores all of the user entries. So no matter which proxy one of these users goes through, they are always able to be identified. Okay. So with that said, let's switch back to my my DC agent server. Something else to note. Okay, so right now these are all on, and then 8 are off. After you've put these after these entries are in here, sometimes new domain controllers may not show up in this DC_config file, or sometimes actually the file itself won't be created automatically. There are lots of KB articles on our support site that explain what to do if the DC config file does not get created automatically, and it's very simple. Essentially, you can just come into this bin folder and create the DC_config.txt file yourself. You just right-click, new file, make it a text file, call it DC_config, and then you'll go ahead and basically enter these entries just as you see them here. So your domain controller hostname, your domain, so your logon domain, put into brackets above, and then once you've listed all of your domain controllers out, the only other thing is you want to make sure there's a carriage return at the bottom of this document. So you can see I have one carriage return underneath. It's easy to make. You just go at the very end and hit enter, and that'll create an extra line that's blank at the bottom. Once you've done that, you do file and save it into that bin directory, and then there's one other step. You just want to right click and you want to make sure that in your security permissions that particular service account has full read-write, full control to this particular file, or this DC_config.txt file that you've made. Once you've done that, the DC agent should work as normal and as expected. Let's see. There's one other thing I wanted to show you. So I showed you a second ago how to collect the user ID map from the actual DC agent itself. Well, I'm going to go back to this Visio diagram real quick. So we've looked at the user map from, let's say, this DC agent and this DC agent. We're making sure that they're collecting user logon records, and they are. But now what we want to do is make sure that the actual appliance or the web security server that they're configured in is also getting a combined map of both of these. So what we can do is run another simple console client command like I did before to actually look at the map that gets created, and the combined map that gets created and stored on your filtering server or your proxy server. And that's pretty easily done by, once again, just going to start command prompt. And I'm going to go ahead and do CD, and I'm going to navigate directly to that bin directory. Okay. And there you go, console client.exe. And in this instance, what you're going to do is point to the IP address that the filtering service is running on, either on your web security proxies or your web security servers that you've created. So in my case, that'll just be 2.68.1.50. And on the appliance, this is the C interface. And I'm going to go over port 15869. And I'll hit enter. And I'm going to hit 2, print self, 1, dump to local file, a level 3, and the file name, I'm going to go ahead and call this simply different from my last one. I just put a 2 after it. So XID user map 2. This is essentially going to be my combined user map that shows it should have entries from both of the individual DC agent XID user map files. So if I hit enter on this, it should create this on the desktop for me. Next step is to select 4. So once I've hit enter there, I select 4 here and then hit enter again, and now it'll create that second XID user map 2 file, and I can see it created on the desktop right here. And if I go ahead and double click on this, I can see that my appliance also has these, or my web security server also has these entries stored on it now. Like I said, I only have one DC agent in my environment, so it's going to have the same entries as that DC agent showed. But if you have multiple, this particular file should show the combined entry list and have all of the users that both individual DC agents are collecting. Alright, with that said, those are some pretty good tips for installing DC Agent. Real quick, I'm going to go ahead and show you just how to, or what kind of information is available on our support site. So if we quickly go to Firefox, and like I said, you just go to support, you can type in DC Agent, and you can find all kinds of information. If you have more troubles and this tutorial isn't able to help you with DC Agent, just click on DC Agent Troubleshooting right here. It makes it very easy. You have a lot of different troubleshooting steps that we've actually created a tutorial to help you address and walk through. So please, once again, use the support site. It has lots of information on it. Thanks a lot for viewing this video, and I hope it was helpful to you.